All right, all right. This is actually kind of working. I don't need that. I minimize that. How do I minimize that? Okay. All right, we're doing great. This is like a whole crazy thing here. Okay, hopefully you guys can hear me okay. Yeah, there's that. Okay, so you guys can see me. Hopefully you can hear me. The conference Wi-Fi is kind of working. We'll officially start here in a minute, but there's also people hanging out at the booth. So if you're watching remotely, then I'm going to be looking down at the camera, but I'm also going to be looking at people that are here. Also, this screen that you can see is also in our booth. So if you type in the chat, other people here in the booth will also be able to see what you're saying, just FYI. Also, it's going to be permanently burned into the recording. So talk with care, I guess, as you ask questions. All right, so just as getting started here. So this is day 3 of the Expo Hall at the user conference. And we're going to be attempting to do this live from the booth. You guys can see this is the booth. I'll show you other people. I'm going to do it upside down though. You guys wave to the people. Yeah, there you go. Nice. Okay. There's too many cables. Okay. Just, you're going to have to go with it. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about MCP in ArcGIS. My goal is to, one, talk about what MCP is, what it allows us to do. And we're also going to talk about the Esri version of that. And then we're going to also build our own live with Claude here. We'll probably do that first so we can let it cook while we're talking about stuff. And then, so hopefully we'll be able to demo that. I did make an API key right before. We will cross our fingers that I did it correctly and that it works. And then we're gonna, and then we're gonna talk about different other types of MCP connectors and kind of what that gets you when you're doing things. And then I have a couple of questions that got submitted to the webinar live stream registration thing. So we'll do those too. So if you guys have questions on the live stream, drop those in the chat and I will try to adjust them as we try to answer them as we go. And if you guys want to jump in, just jump in. You might get caught on the mic. It is doing a pretty good job of cutting out external audio, but like, you might be permanently recorded. Just that is your consent agreement right there. Okay. All right. Okay. So let me switch to screen sharing here. Okay. So what we're gonna do here is, this is all about MCP. So this is going to be an hour of MCP. MCP stands for Model Context Protocol, which is a lot of words, but it's kind of like AI's API. So it's a way to define a set of functions or tools or processes that you can give to an AI, and then that AI can call it, right? So you've got large language models, you've got things like Claude or ChatGPT, various sizes, and they have internal like reasoning capabilities, but in order to get them to be able to do something, you have to give them tools. That tool might be read from the local file system or write to the local file system. It could be read SharePoint or write SharePoint. It could be read your emails. It could be make a draft email, or it could be do a geocode, do a search for a location. It could be generate a route or make a map or query a feature layer. And so by giving it these tools, that's how we kind of give it the superpower of being able to interact with our own data and ground it with our own data. So that's how we get really good high quality answers, is by giving it access to things. You dropped something just a second ago. Well, it wasn't important. Oh, well. So that's kind of MCP in a nutshell. So we're going to come back to how we do MCPs in a second, and we're going to start building one. So Esri is creating and is going to have soon an MCP for enterprise and online and location platform. But we're going to build one ourselves just for fun. It just does a couple of things right now. And I have Claude Code over here running in a blank directory. I didn't know this was going to happen, but we're actually going to get to use Claude Fable, which is the kind of big, high-powered model. And I have no usage on it today so far, so we're going to get to really cook and see what happens here. And basically, what we're going to do is we're going to ask it to build us an MCP that does two things. The first is doing a geocode. So like if I want to find the convention center or I want to find Balboa Park, we're going to be able to find that with the Esri geocoder. So we're going to be able to get lat longs from a place name or an address, right? And the second is doing a route so that we can get step-by-step directions. You probably have all seen demos of this in like different Esri plenaries where they showed like getting a route, getting step-by-step instructions inside a chatbot. So we're going to build the thing that powers that right now. So what I'm going to start with is I'm going to copy this prompt, which I created ahead of time with my AI assistant as I was panicking, trying to figure out what I was going to do right now about 40 minutes ago. So my AI assistant wrote this prompt, which is basically, we're doing this live demo. Our goal is to show that this MCP stuff is not magic. You can create your own, you can integrate your own, you can connect data together. So we're going to copy this. We're going to come over here. We're going to paste it straight into Claude Code, and we're going to let it run. So the goal here is we're going to make a plan. So whenever I use Claude Code to build an application like this, whether it's a big project or a small project, the first step is always to make a plan. So my goal is to come up with what I'm going to build. Sometimes I know what I want. Sometimes I'm brainstorming with Claude. And sometimes I have no idea what I'm doing. So but at the end of that iteration, whether I'm brainstorming or I'm just designing, my goal is to have a plan. So I want to define what it is I'm going to do. You can think of this as a simplified version of what you might give a human developer to build something. And so what's happening over here on the left is Claude has taken our prompt and kind of understands what we're doing and is asking us some questions. So we're gonna read some questions and we're gonna see what our answers are. How much should the directions tool return? This decides what the audience needs to see when they ask for routing. So a summary plus turn by turn, that's what it recommends, or just a summary only, or we can type something or chat about it. So if I don't know what I want, I can go into chat mode and I can go back and forth with Claude to kind of refine what I'm doing. If I know what I want and it's not there, I can type it in. In this case, I like summary and turn by turn. Also, we're trying to cram this into an hour, so we want to make sure we can get there. So we're going to take a default. Okay, so registration. How do I want to register the MCP server live? Typed on stage or pre-baked? Type Claude MCP add live, one command, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, I think we're going to do that. We're going to say that. Probably what I'm going to end up doing is making Claude do that, but we'll get there. And we're just going to submit those answers. So just had the two questions. You can control when you're doing a planning step like this, you could control how much Claude asks you. So if you want it to be highly interactive, tell it that. Tell it that you want to go back and forth, you want to refine it, you want to talk to it, and it will usually play along, and we'll do that. Okay, so let's look at our plan. It looks like it's made it here. So, whoa, scrolling's hard. I don't know how to scroll. I've lost that ability. Okay, so Act 1, blindfolded. I don't know why that's there. In plain Claude Code session, no MCP, ask what the exact driving distance and time from San Diego Convention Center to Balboa Park right now, and have it hedge and estimate. Okay, we will do that real quick in a second. And then Act 2, we will give it the MCP and we'll have it do that. It claims that's only going to be 40 lines of code. That's going to be fascinating if that is all it ends up being. So we'll see. But that's also kind of an interesting thing because a lot of times MCPs themselves don't have to do a lot. They're translating from what the AI needs into an existing API. right? So anything that has an existing API, you can put an MCP on, and then the agent can leverage it. So it often doesn't have to do much other than translation, sometimes token reduction, token optimization, things like that. So it's possible that this is only 40 lines of code. We'll see. And then we're gonna have one Python file. We're gonna use a thing called FastMCP. I'm gonna come back to that. So two tools, one to geocode / find address. So that's how we're gonna get from address to lat long. And then one to do directions. Okay, fairly straightforward. Everybody on board. Nobody's giving us any chat messages. You guys, I'm getting a lot of people nodding heads here in the conference. So you guys that are like on the live stream, you should say things. Okay. And yeah, and then we will just test all of this and then we'll see what happens. We'll do some different variations on a theme here. Okay. So it's worried about our Wi-Fi. I'm worried about the Wi-Fi too, but we're doing a video stream, so whatever. Okay. So what we're going to first do is we're going to switch over here. This is the same directory. I was just testing the API key in it. So we're going to open up Claude real quick. And we're just going to ask it this question, which is, what's the exact driving distance and time from the San Diego Convention Center to Balboa Park right now? So this is actually going to be really interesting. I'm not sure what it's going to do. It might end up, it's going to go check Google Maps. Oh, it's going to open Chrome. That's going to be interesting. So we'll see what happens here, but I think it's actually going to open. This might actually work, unfortunately. It might do something semi smart here by opening up Chrome and finding out what's going on. Let's see. Or my Chrome is not logged in, which we might find out that that's just not working. Okay. Still thinking about it. Okay. Chrome isn't connected. Yeah, that's unfortunate. Okay, we'll let it cook for a second and see what it falls back to. Okay, so while that's going here, we'll talk a little bit more about MCPs in general. So at the beginning, I said that MCPs are kind of a way to expose an API or functions, if you will. Tools is what we often call them in AI terms, to a large language model. So these are things that it can call to take actions. There are lots of ways that you can connect MCPs. If you're writing your own code, if you're writing Python or you're using Claude to write Python, there's one fast way to do this is with a thing called FastMCP. Basically, this is a Python library that takes care of the plumbing, right? So you can turn building all of the plumbing for an MCP into a function. That's how we're going to get down to like 80 lines of code, right? Is we're going to have a function that we can write that integrates into FastMCP that's going to do our work. And then FastMCP is going to get the question from Claude and then return the result. Okay, so that it's kind of our wrapper here. Okay, let's see. So couldn't get live traffic data. Claude Chrome extension isn't connected. That's my bad. But 3 miles and about a 10-minute drive. So I don't know. That's kind of interesting. It didn't give us directions, but like it did a thing. So that's kind of an interesting marker. So let's come over here and let's get this built. Let's build it. Okay, so we're gonna let Claude work on that, and we're gonna go back to MCPs because MCPs are really important. This is how you get it to do real agentic work. This is also how you focus it on solving particular problems. So, for example, we built a chatbot for a client recently where it needed to answer data based on Wow, it's been a long week. Need to answer questions based on data in feature services. And we want to make sure that every answer is grounded in a record from a service or a summary of records, right? It's doing a sum or a count or something like that. And so what we want to do is we want to create a set of tools that it can use to get that data. So we want to be able to do some kind of search because we want to be able to look for the data set we want. We might have 1, 5, 10, 50, 100 data sets, right? And so you want to be able to search for a data set. When we find a data set, we want to be able to query it. We want to be able to do a where clause. We want to be able to do counts, sums, averages, some basic statistic functions, group bys, things like that. And then we might even want to do a spatial query sometimes. Now, in a simple chat interaction, we often don't want a spatial query without a geocode, right? We don't want the AI to assume it knows where Portland, Oregon is. It probably does. Most of the time it will be right, but when it's wrong, we don't want it to be wrong. So we want to give it a geocode tool so that it can always use it can always have a good geometry to do that type of search. So we want to combine those tools together. And the best, easiest way to do that and make it reusable is with MCP. And then when we do that, we have different ways we can deploy that chatbot. For example, we could go to like Azure Foundry and we could deploy an MCP in Azure. We could connect it to Azure Foundry. We could then deploy an agent in Foundry terms that has that. And then we don't have to do a lot of infrastructure. We could also spin up a FastMCP and a small JavaScript app on a small container and deploy it, right? So you have multiple paths that you can take to deploy things like that. But at the end of the day, kind of the big value is that you have these see you later, man. You have these reusable chunks, right? Because if you build yourself MCP that can access this data, then you can reuse it in multiple agents without having to kind of rewrite a bunch of things. You can just redeploy it in multiple agents, especially if you're doing something like internally to your organization versus a public one. You have a lot of kind of different capabilities. Okay, so let's check in on how Claude is doing here. So we're making sure Python's installed. We're doing dependencies. We're testing things. So we're kind of doing things in the background that are probably consuming a lot of bandwidth. Okay, so it says it's built. That's fascinating. All right. So let's see. We are live right now, man. Can you demo this working? So it thinks that we have this. So we should be able to see some tool usages. We should be able to see it execute this, and we should be able to see tool use. So we'll see if this works. Maybe we'll switch to the other tab and try it fresh over there also after we see this work. But one of the things that helps a lot inside a Claude session like this is having it test itself, whether that's writing unit tests or connecting it to Chrome and having it view the website that it's built, make sure that you asked it to add a button, make sure that button is actually there, and doing those kinds of things. So it works much better because the code is deterministic, even though the large language model isn't. The code it's writing is. So if it runs it and tests it, you're much more likely to get a working solution at the end than you are to have it just spit out code and then you test it. So it works better to kind of let it iterate in a tight cycle, and then you end up kind of testing the result instead of testing the intermediate steps. That varies, right? Large code bases can have different problems. Complex algorithms sometimes need help. But generally speaking, that kind of helps. So we can actually see down here at the bottom, it's actually running Claude in a shell right now. It's testing itself by calling itself in a shell with a request. So this is not going to be very convincing, I think, that it worked. But we'll let it cook here, and then we'll then we'll go to the other one and we'll try it. We'll register it and try it there ourselves so we can see. Because that's really the end goal is I want to see it work. Yeah.
Tell us test this up. Is that an original prompt you copy pasted in, or is that something?
It normally would be in that prompt, or it would be in my Claude MD file. I guess I should probably repeat the question. The question was, when I told it to test it, is that something I put in the original prompt, or is that something I might include elsewhere? So I often would include that prompt in what I'm asking for. Like I might say, test this until it's done, or iterate on this until it's done. Or I might, I will often, if I'm doing kind of highly autonomous work, I will totally put that into my Claude MD file. I'll tell it that its job is to work autonomously and to achieve goals, and I'm going to give it a goal, and I want it to work until the goal is achieved, and then return. And so that's kind of like, because I often want it in goal mode, not step-by-step mode. So like you can kind of use Claude Code in like two different ways. You can use it as like pair programmer, where you're working back and forth with it. And that's super useful, right? And it's also super safe because it's not going to go crazy. But you can also use it in goal mode, where you give it a goal and then you let it operate towards that goal until it thinks it achieves it. And then you start checking the answer. So yeah, so I often do it in goal mode. I will often run it with ignore all permission requests and run unsafely and do all of those things, but I do it on a separate machine that's not the one where I have all my important things. So yeah. Long answer to a short question, I guess. Yeah. Okay, so it thinks it ran this and it like is summarizing the result of that, and that's kind of interesting, but I think let's come over here. MCP add ArcGIS. Oh, I forgot to put a slash in front of it. That was well. Now it's off doing something else that I didn't really want it to do. Actually, don't want you to do that. No, I want the local one. Did it tell me how to add this? And I'm just talking so fast that I'm ignoring it. Oh, there we go. That's what I want. Okay. We'll get out of there. Add that. Great. Okay, I'm at the oh, you know what? Let's make this easier. I'm at the San Diego Convention Center and I want walking directions to Balboa Park. So we'll see if that works. I use the ArcGIS tools to geocode both locations and get walking directions. That's a good first step. Okay, so that's pretty good. Calling ArcGIS, see what happens. I'm optimistic. We'll see. Feel like it should have. Oh, there it is. Okay. Here's the route from the San Diego Convention Center to Balboa Park, about 2.6 miles. It only computes driving routes, so the 11-minute estimate is a driving time on foot. Probably longer than 11 minutes. So go southeast to the grand stairway toward the convention center court. Turn left, turn. I mean, that's pretty good. They're driving directions, but like that's pretty good compared to our original one. Remember that tried to kind of search for random things and gave us kind of a vague set of directions. So I think that basically serves the purpose of demonstrating the MCP grounds the activity that the agent is doing. Without it, it's going to try to solve the problem, answer the question by looking around and looking for the answer online, whereas here we've given it the tools in order to get the right answer. And the same thing can be true for your own data internally or for other things. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about for a minute is this thing called Composio. So Composio is an MCP amalgamator, is the best way I can describe it. And they have a really fascinating model. So they have thousands of connectors. So you can hook it to, your Google Drive, your SharePoint, your HubSpot, your whatever, and you can manage all of the authentication directly in Composio. So it makes it easier to connect these things. But what I think is really fascinating is the way that they expose it. So I'll back up for a second. When you have an agent or a chatbot, one of the things that you're really trying to manage is context. You're trying to manage how many words, how many tokens are in that context, because if you fill it up, then it's done. And the more you put in there, the less likely it can recall 100%. So the less data you put in there, the more accurate it'll be. The more you fill it up, the recall will start to drop. Now, things like these really big models like Fable, they actually have really high recall rates. So like you can stick an entire book in there and you can put in the first part of a sentence and it'll be able to finish the sentence from that book. And it will have a recall rate of like over 90% on that. Whereas as humans, we have way less than that. Like I don't know, if you gave me a book and told me to read it and then gave me the first half of a sentence, I don't know, there's like a 10% chance I could do that, right? Like I wouldn't be able to do it. So anyway, so what Composio does to try to make that work is they provide a couple of MCP tools, and one is search for a tool and execute a tool. So you can provide thousands of tools to your agent. Composio will kind of gateway that. The agent can then go search for a tool to talk to your CRM. Composio will respond back with, yeah, I have that tool. Here's 5 things that you can do with it. And then it can dynamically call any of those tools. And you can get away with that without filling up the context window with literally thousands of tool listings, where you might even have 2 tools that are very similar that it could get confused on. So Composio is it's a really interesting take on handling that problem, because most people are just like, well, turn them on and off. Turn off the ones you don't need when you're about to do the request, but then you have to remember to turn them back on when you need to talk to SharePoint or talk to Google Drive or whatever. And so you have to kind of go back and forth. Whereas Composio kind of lets you have all of them in there and lets you manage that all together. So it's a really interesting way to kind of manage that. Okay, so back to MCPs for ArcGIS. So Esri has one coming for enterprise, and it has a couple of tools in it. So it's got the important ones are searching for a layer, and then the second most important one is querying that layer. So you can build interactive chat applications that will be able to find authoritative data and then query that authoritative data. So what's going to become really interesting and what will become really important is getting the metadata correct so that the agent can find the right layer, and so it knows which columns to query. Now, what's kind of interesting is agents are incredibly resilient. So even with really poor metadata, it will do a good job of figuring it out by querying. So by grabbing a sample of a layer and looking at the fields, it'll actually figure out which one you meant, probably. Now, you can short circuit that by having good metadata and you'll save tokens in the end, but they are quite resilient. So you don't have to like make perfect metadata on all layers before you start trying to use agents. Over time, adding that will save you on tokens, but you can start to experiment with the efficiency of agents very quickly. The one thing that the Well, back up. So the other interesting thing that the enterprise MCP is going to have is geoprocessing tools. So you're going to be able to publish geoprocessing tools into the MCP. So you can publish existing ones and you can also publish custom ones. Now, you have to be kind of careful with that because you want to make sure that those tools are kind of compatible with what an agent wants. So you want to make sure that you're like outputting temporary layers or you're outputting new layers that the agent can then query. You don't want to return like a blob, a 500 kilobyte blob of JSON, right? The agent, it'll consume that fine, but it might forget things. Because behind the scenes, these agents often are writing things to disk and then running Python or command line, PowerShell to look at files and do things. So you have to be careful with those. The other thing that is worth being aware of is that when you want to do spatial operations between two layers in an agent, you need to have a tool that can do that for it. So if I want to, for example, if I have a layers that like a nationwide list of hospital layers, wow, just really burning through words here. A nationwide layer of hospital points. And then you had like the San Andreas Fault. And you might have a simplified version of the San Andreas Fault that is just one line. Or you could have the original authoritative data set, which is actually thousands of little tiny lines where all of the little fault segments are. And you might say, I want to find all the hospitals within 20 miles of the San Andreas Fault. If I'm in Pro, that's pretty straightforward, right? I take that layer, I can buffer it, I do an intersect, bam, I'm done, right? Or I can do like a spatial select, several ways I can handle that. If I'm in ArcGIS Online, it's a little bit more complicated, right? I need to run those geoprocessing tools to create the buffer and to do the intersect, and it's going to create intermediate layers in my ArcGIS Online, right? If an agent is going to do it, if you don't give it access to tools that it can use to create those layers, it's going to do something interesting. It's actually going to go out and it's going to download all of, say, the San Andreas Fault records. And then it's going to do a spatial search against the hospital layer thousands of times in order to try to answer this question. And it's going to try to save all of that in its context. And it can get kind of complicated because one, it's a lot of requests. Two, you're asking the agent to remember many digits of text or numbers, and you're asking it to remember them accurately. And it's not good at that. It's very easy for it to just flip a number while it's run, just like we would, right? You write down thousands of numbers, it's easy to make a mistake. So you have the same kind of problem in an agent. So the way to fix that is to give it tools that it can use to solve that problem. So that's being careful about what layers are available to your MCP. It's being careful about what geoprocessing processes are available and what custom tools are available inside your MCP. Now, you can also do this really fascinating pattern of, and this is not secure. So you have to be very careful with how you deploy and manage a tool like this. But what you can do is you can deploy a custom geoprocessing tool in Enterprise where the input is Python. It's text. Agents are very good at Python. So if you tell it it can execute Python that has ArcPy and has access to these layers, and this is the connection file, it will write Python, call that geoprocessing tool to execute that Python and return a layer. And if you orchestrate it correctly and document it right for the agent, you'll end up with a really fascinating capability where it can write geoprocessing Python, ArcPy, execute it and get the layer back and then use that to get results, which is incredibly powerful. But you're giving it the ability to run Python on your ArcGIS server. So You got to be aware of what permissions, what's there, can it escape the sandbox, all of those kinds of things. Because if it tries to change directory out into C, Windows, System 32 and does something else, and you're running with elevated permissions, you might be really unhappy with the results. So incredibly powerful pattern, but you got to be careful with it. Yeah. So MCPs, that's how you get functions and tools into large language models, and that's how you get it to be able to do kind of real autonomous agentic loops, processes, is giving it access to those tools, giving it access to your own data. And when you're deploying those, you're adding documentation. So you're describing what this tool is for to the agent. So you can narrow it very specifically, or you can make it quite broad. And you kind of have that capability by adding the prompt that goes with that that component. Okay, I'm gonna make sure that I feel like the webinar chat is never quite this quiet. Whoa, there's some inception. Oh, but there's only a few people online, probably because everybody is here. Okay, so that's fine. Thinking about what I want to talk about. Okay, so the other kind of interesting, just kind of some side security things to be aware of when you're doing this is you probably see online, you'll have seen folks that are like, hey, I deleted my production database. Why did you give it access to delete your production database is my question. But when you're working inside ArcGIS, we often are using highly privileged accounts, right? We're connecting to a database and we have permissions to alter schema, right? Because we are high trust individuals. But if you were to hire a new consultant, would you give them permissions to drop all your tables on the first day? I don't know, you might, but you probably shouldn't. Same thing goes with an AI. So, except the trust doesn't scale, right? You can't earn trust with an AI over time. You can kind of learn its patterns, but it can still always make a mistake. So if it shouldn't ever need to drop a field, don't give it permissions to drop a field. If it's only reading data, make sure you scope it so they can only read data. So for example, my agent, JAWS, has read-only access to my email so that it can sit there and it can look at my email. It can ping me on Slack and let me know, hey, something important has come in, you should go pay attention to it, but it can't delete it, it can't archive it, it can't respond to it without me being there to do that work. And I think that, so you got to understand the kind of blast radius, the consequence of adding an agent to a thing. And that's incredibly important when you start building kind of autonomous components, when you start giving it actual capabilities beyond just, there's no blast radius on do 2 geocodes and get a route, which is what we did here. Right? There's no real consequence of it getting that wrong, other than it might send me on a weird route or a weird journey. So there isn't much blast radius here. But if I'm doing something where I'm altering data or computing data or generating data that someone else might see, there are consequences to that. And you need to be aware of what the accuracy rate of it doing the right thing can be or can't be. So you have to just kind of pay attention to that. You got to test it. We were doing a project with a client recently where we're using Claude Code like this to automate extraction of data out of public websites into a feature service. So think things like, hospital records, urgent care facilities, things that you as like a municipality might want to know where they are. You might want phone numbers, you might want addresses, you might want things like that, but they're not going to tell you where they are necessarily. They're not going to update you when they change phone numbers, schools changing principals, all kinds of things that you might want to know about, but they're not going to tell you. Building a Claude Code agent that can go out, find that information on the internet, and then suggest updates back to you for you to kind of go through, process, and then deploy. So I wouldn't let it update it on its own, probably, without a human verifying it, but it is highly accurate. Like in some of our runs, it Like you run it on 100 records and it does every single one of those records correctly. So it is actually quite good at these processes. So it's very tempting to just be like, oh, I'll just let it deploy. I'll just let it do that for me. But I think it's super important to be aware of what the real accuracy is. You have to run it on thousands of records over time and keep an eye on what it's actually doing and how it's behaving. So Agnes, who's one of my coworkers and working on this, just posted in the chat, I've had Claude in cowork mode accidentally delete a folder with a shell script that it realized was incorrect and then try to go through Time Machine on a Mac to try to get it back. Is there a way to prevent this? I asked it, it asked initial permissions to work in the folder, but never asked about running a script to delete a directory inside it. The best way to deal with that is probably to use a Git repository in that folder. Git is what we would use as software developers to track history and changes over time. But it can track almost any files locally. You don't have to push it off your own machine. But you can at least track history locally. You can tell Claude, don't delete things without asking. But it might forget. So you can't rely on it. If you're working in a highly sensitive environment and you're worried about that, you could get out of auto mode. Auto mode is basically whenever Claude Code wants to do something, by default, it asks you for permission. But if it says, I want to edit this file, you have the option to say yes, yes always, or I allow all edits to files in this subdirectory. And so most of the time I'm like, allow all, right? Because I don't want it asking me every time it wants to change one word in a document somewhere in the folder. So I'm saying allow all, but what that means is it's not going to tell me every time it does that, right? It's going to be in the log going by, but it's going to type way faster than I can, and I can't keep up with all those changes. So what you really need is kind of the ability to have history to go back. So if you're using SharePoint has built-in history, or Google Drive can have history turned on. Or if you're using source code like Python, using Git to store the history of what it's doing over time. I realized I totally messed up that whole description of what was happening there. So when you authorize it to make a change like that, you can also go to auto mode. And what auto mode does is it uses another language model to look at the request and decide if it feels safe. And if it feels safe, it'll automatically approve it for you. And I would say most of the time that works well, but Agnes's example is like it deleted a file on accident, even like it deleted a file where it didn't necessarily even mean to, but it did. And then had to figure out how to recover it, which is just kind of unfortunate. Like, but it's kind of like what we would do, right? Sometimes you accidentally select a folder and you delete it and you're like, oh, that didn't mean to delete that. I better go get that from a backup. So the problem is it just goes faster than we do. And it's hard to keep up with what it's doing. So keeping backups, keeping Time Machine, you have a Windows machine, having, a hard drive plugged in so you have backups going all the time. Using things like SharePoint and Google Drive to have cloud backups of stuff, using local Git repository to keep history of changes and things locally that you can track over time. All of these kind of different techniques are important because you never know what it's going to go do at the end of the day, which is kind of spooky, but kind of it happens. Okay, so there's like 15 minutes left. So I got a couple of questions that were submitted that I wanted to talk about. And then I don't know if anybody standing around here wants to ask questions. That's cool too. Online, Danny asked about detecting cracks on roads or sidewalks using AI. So I think what he's referring to is mostly you have like a vehicle driving around taking footage of sidewalks, and you want to be able to know like where are cracks Where is it deteriorated? Where do you need to send repair crews? Like, what's the status of the sidewalk? And there are some open source models that can do that I would not, my guess is that like for even a small city, there would be so many images to process that it's going to be really expensive to send that to like Anthropic or OpenAI and have it look at every image and tell you if the sidewalk is cracked. My hunch is that it would be fairly accurate at doing that, is like telling you, does this include a crack on the sidewalk or not? My guess is that Claude or OpenAI could totally do that, or Gemini. Any of them would be able to do that. And if that image was georeferenced, you could totally be like, yes, this image includes cracks. We're 70% sure, and put that in a feature service and kind of keep track of that, right? So you could even go back and QC it. But I do think you might want to use a cheaper model, because I suspect that there's going to be a lot of those images. So you probably want to use one of the cheaper models that's hosted, or you want a custom model that you can run locally. And I think that there are some open source models that can do that. One thing that I often do for questions like this is I might go into Claude and just say, let's see, I think I have Opus on this account, or Fable on this account. So I might just be like, are there any open source models that I could use to accurately detect cracks in sidewalks from photographs or videos from a vehicle driving around a city to inspect them? So let's have Claude go and do some research to like find out what are our options. And this is often a good first step that I'll do when I don't know an answer. I'll ask Claude. And it does not mean that I am not going to go read those and educate myself on these things, but it does give me a place to start. It gives me something that I'm going to have links, I'm going to have information. Now I can go educate myself either by continuing to ask Claude or going to those sources and reading about them and trying to understand them a bit more. So we'll see what that comes back to. Second question was about ongoing development of MCP connections for ArcGIS Online and Enterprise, and use cases on those. So we talked a lot about MCP throughout this whole thing. So to kind of recap, Esri is creating MCPs for ArcGIS Enterprise online and location platform. They do various things, but the most interesting things within Enterprise are finding layers, so searching for layers, finding them, querying them, and then being able to do published geoprocessing steps. So that could be a custom geoprocessing tool, or it could be a built-in geoprocessing tool and creating a new data set. So all of those kinds of things are going to get baked into that kind of MCP that it's in beta right now, coming soon. Hopefully we're going to get it for multiple versions of Enterprise, so we can kind of start doing that. There's going to be some interesting things where you have to tag data sets that are allowed into the MCP. There's some interesting things with security and models around security there. So there's still moving parts as this stuff is developing, but there's going to be some really cool stuff there. But as we also demonstrated, you can totally build your own simple ones very quickly to achieve your own kind of quick agentic process, even if it's just for yourself. Having MCPs that talk to your own data and your own things can be really useful. It's like, oh man, which layer has this in it again? I'll give you an example. I've been writing an AI newsletter for over a year now. Every week on Fridays, I publish a newsletter. And I don't remember. See what we're on here, because I don't actually remember. Okay, so this week will be episode 74. I do not remember what they all are, but sometimes I'm like, man, I think I wrote about that. And so I have a AI agent on my website that I can come to, and I can ask it, it's like, oh, what was the episode where I did X? Like, what episode did we talk about judges? Judges are the idea of adding security around an agent to make sure that it doesn't take actions that you don't want it to take. And so it's going to go off, look in the index, find the episode or episodes, the newsletter editions that where I wrote about that, and come back. So even just for me to remember all of within my knowledge repository that I've published online, or within my knowledge repository internally, having an AI be able to search and find those things for me is incredibly powerful. Just that search and kind of amalgamation process can be really, really powerful. Okay, I can talk about this stuff all day, but there are a couple of you guys standing here. So do you guys have any questions that you want me to talk about while I'm still live?
I had one about,
Yeah.
I was hearing about skills the other day.
Yeah.
That Esri specific, or is that something I don't know anything about?
Yeah. It's a really good question. So the question is about what are skills? So skills are, they're not an Esri specific thing. It started from Anthropic defining basically repeatable processes that you wanted an AI to be able to do. Almost all of the agent platforms now support them. So you can create a skill and pass it to someone else and they can use it. An example of one that we talked about recently at dymaptic was we built 2 skills for ArcGIS Monitor. The first is to build insight views. So because you basically, how do you build a dashboard inside ArcGIS Monitor to see like what services are busy, which ones are popular, et cetera. But it's like a whole new set of schema. You have to understand a lot of things about IT and response times, and there's a lot of words you have to learn. So we built a skill to quickly build those. So you can just be like, I want a view that lets me understand the shared versus dedicated instances across my ArcGIS enterprise from the last week. And it'll churn for a minute, build that view, and then you can import it into Monitor, and now you have a way to look at that. Another one is like building HTML executive reports out of Monitor. So you can be like, tell me, summarize everything that happened of significance in my ArcGIS platform over the last week. And it will sit there, and what the skill does is it defines how to talk to that API. So instead of building an MCP, we actually built some code that says, here's how you query this, here's how you query that, here's how you query this. And the skill basically allows the AI to read all of those instructions and then execute that code to go and read that data. And then it'll actually download it into like CSVs or JSON files and write more code to iterate on it to get you information. So instead of basically we're telling it to not internalize that data, don't read it into your context window and summarize it. Instead, write it to a file on disk and then run some code on it to do statistics, to get the sum, to get the average, to get the counts. That way, you're not relying on the AI's brain to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You're relying on Python to do the counting, which is deterministic. And it's way more likely to be successful when that happens. So yeah, skills are basically repeatable processes that you want to take and pass for yourself or to other people.
Difference between that and a catalog. So I have a catalog where you got a full task and then 17 steps. Some of them are MCP, some of them are plain Python. One in the middle might be Claude, go do this.
Yep.
4 more steps. Would you say the difference is there?
I would say that the skills are going to be smaller focused bits. They're going to like, you might have multiple steps in that might map to a skill. The skills tend to be smaller, I would say. And like the catalog tends to be more of like the agentic guide or the agentic platform that it's running through.
Connect SQL credentials, but skill might be for do that, do this, export it.
Yes. Yeah. So a skill might be, here's the schema of my SQL Server database, and here are common requests, and here's how these work, and here's how you might query these, in addition to what you can, determine yourself. And then it might reuse that multiple times in a bigger catalog of steps. Yeah. So it's kind of one of the things that helps a lot when getting an AI to do a really long running thing is is breaking it down into smaller steps. So you might take a big process and chop it into 3 steps. And then you might take step 1 and break it down into 4 or 5 steps. And you might even take one of those and break it down even further, depending on how big it is, right? And so you end up with like this big, like a root system almost of steps. And then at the end of the day, the AI is going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it's going to go through like the 100 different steps down here. But in that granularity gives you more control over it. And the smaller the step is, the more likely it is to be successful. But also the more work you have to put in to kind of help it break down those steps. So there's really interesting things in some of the big agent harnesses where it automatically tries to break those down and tries to do that.
Found like I define a human fluid task, and then I try to get it to build my 17 steps, and then on the 12th step, it wants to use Playwright to search Google for the first return. And I'm like, stop doing that. I don't have a Google API. And so I say, go use Claude for that.
Yeah.
So I'm okay to use it because Claude has it.
Claude can do that. Yeah. Yeah.
Fast.
Yeah.
Well,
yes.
so I'm like, you can use tokens on that.
Yeah.
Not this other stuff.
But not this other stuff. Yeah. And I think that's like one of the most interesting things to me, because it's like, it has a default that it wants to do. And like sometimes talking it out of that default is hard. And yeah.
Continually try to play with it. Suppose I use Playwright.
Yeah.
I wanna use that.
And that's one of the problems with MCPs in general, is like you hook a dozen MCPs up to an agent and it's like, oh, you gave me a Playwright, I better talk to it. Like it wants to leverage those things, especially Claude. Claude really likes to call tools, which is good because that means it's way more likely to be grounded correctly in the right data. But it also means that it really wants to call tools. So it can end up making more of a mess than anything else. And our unexpected capacity constraints. That's what I get for picking Fable. Just try it on Opus, see what happens.
So are the skills, I'm really new to all this.
Yeah.
Are the skills saved to a file and you say, hey, Claude, go look at this skill file?
Yep. Yeah. So there is usually just a markdown file, but you can make a whole folder. You can put a skill.md in it, which is all the instructions, and then you might include like some Python. It's like, here's this Python that can run this and query this and get it back, or do these different things. Like say you have a common thing where you need to go query this, go query that, and join it together, right? You might write Python that does that operation, put that into the skill with it so that that's one of the things it knows how to do, and it'll use that as reference. So like, for example, we have a skill internally that we use to help with building project estimates. Project estimates. For like estimating like how much work it's going to take how many hours it'll take to do something. And that writes to Excel. And so basically the skill is a bunch of instructions about how to walk an engineer through doing an estimate, because we're terrible at it. And also a bunch of code examples and a spreadsheet that is the core, so that it fills in the right tab and that the auto calculations are still working on all the other tabs. And so it knows like exactly what to do. What's interesting about that skill is I had Claude build that skill for me. So I started by, here's the spreadsheet. We're gonna build a skill that does this. Let's walk through building it. And then at the end, it's a zip file. It's called a .skill, but it's a zip file. It's like a pro, MPK or whatever that is actually a zip under the hood. So you get a .skill file. It's got a folder with all that stuff in it. But it's really just a zip. You can just open it up and look at it. It's all plain text. That's the common denominator for AI, is everything has to get into English words, or not English, but words. Yeah.
Those MPs that Claude's been recently sort of lamenting that there's 178 rows in here. I need it to be less than 140. Have you run into that? Like, what is going on with that? So
yeah, I would say that Anthropic generally has been trying to strongly suggest that you make those short. Yeah. And so the trick is the core skill MD file has to be short, and you put reference MD files that it points to.
To the thumb.
Yep. And you break them up into small pieces. That way, when it reads one and it wants to read another, it doesn't have to read the whole thing to find out. It can just read a small chunk. But Claude will do it for you if you ask it to just break it up. Yeah. Yeah.
I
Okay.
think my problem is that full task with steps and you need skills.
You need to break up some of those into skills so they're reusable. Okay, that's an hour, so I'm going to call it there. Those of you that are online, thank you for joining. We are going to do the next one of these will be August 20th. As Holly said in the chat, we'll have a link coming soon, but it'll be on dymaptic.com/events. And I don't know, we'll build something next time, probably something slightly more complicated because it's kind of hard to build while you're here in a booth doing things. But thank you everyone for coming, and we'll see you next time.